All right, John is here, Sports Bash Live. He appears via the Boardwalk Honda hotline. A lot of NFL news and notes today. The Combine, the Eagles brass speaking. Howie Roseman, Doug Peterson, both speaking at the Combine today. Also, a lot of other news to dive into with 97.3 ESPN.com's John McMullen. He's with us here on the Boardwalk Honda hotline. Johnny Mac, what's happening, pal?
Hello, Michael. How are you?
All is well here in the big city as the Eagles brass speaking for the first time since the Super Bowl, really. I guess the Combine, I know the new league year hasn't started, but really the Combine is the first chance to for them to look ahead to the 2018 edition of the Super Bowl champion Eagles.
Yeah, it really is. This is where the page has kind of turned and you stop looking back and start looking forward. And that's what happens. I mean, it's still February until tomorrow. So the Eagles won the Super Bowl earlier this month. And right now we're looking forward to next season. That's how quickly it comes on, especially when you have the deep playoff run. So you don't have a lot of time to pat yourself on the back, and you got to start making some difficult decisions.
Well, it's that whole theory, too, of when you used to hear so many times from Cowboy fan, Giant fan, Redskin fan, well, how many Super Bowls have you won? Well, none, but guess what? They get forgotten really quick. I mean, it gets put in the rear view, and you're on to the next season that quickly, and that's what's going on here. You're already getting questions about what's next, and Doug Peterson speaking today, saying he's going to have open communication with Nick Foles. And Jason Avant was on the show a couple of weeks ago, and he said to us that's the way that he thinks they should approach it, that they should sit in a room with him and basically say, look, give us a couple places that you want to go, or do you want to stay here? But let Nick kind of write his own story here.
Yeah, and that's the emotion part of it that we've talked a lot about because you got to weigh the fact that Nick Foles is a hero in this town. He's an icon, and he forever will be for finally getting this team over the hump and where so many other people have failed before. We all understand from a logical standpoint that Donovan McNabb was a better quarterback than Nick Foles, or we all should. I should put that caveat on there. Go back to Ron Jaworski, and certainly Carson Wentz is in that category. But the bottom line is none of them won the Super Bowl. Nick Foles won the Super Bowl, and that's something that is very difficult. You don't have to look very far. All you got to do is go up the turnpike. And we've talked about Eli Manning a lot in the New York Giants. Pat Shurmur was talking today at the Combine, and they're acting like they're going to move forward with Eli Manning as the quarterback, even though they have the number 2 overall pick. We don't know if that's lip service or not at this point, but Eli's got 2, and it's tough to move on from that. Even when logic says you should, it's difficult. And for the case of the Eagles, the reality is, and we've said it a lot on this show, Nick Foles' value is never going to be higher than it is right now. So do you take advantage of that, or do you play it safe? That's the difficult decision the Eagles have to make. And then you have the realization that you don't want to put Nick Foles in a bad spot or a bad place where he's going to fail. And the reality is those two things might not align as far as getting the best package and putting Nick in the best place.
Yeah, John. So today Doug Peterson spoke upon it. He said you got to have that conversation, when asked about what you do with Nick Foles. He said you got to have that conversation. He says, I'm a big believer in you don't just blindside a player like that if it happens. So he acknowledged when he said a player like that, he acknowledges how important he is. He says, I think you got to have that open communication with him, and we'll see where it goes. Howie just mentioned we'd love to have everybody back, but we know the nature of the business. So he didn't shut the door on it, and he also said we understand that we need to talk to Nick and kind of get a balance. So they understand they are in a very delicate spot here.
Yeah, and they really are. And, I think if you look at the wording Doug put together, it's kind of like there's some wiggle room there, so it's very smart because you do want to have the discussion with Nick Foles, but the discussion might be, look, this is the best trade we got for you, and it's coming down, but this is what we have to do for the betterment of this franchise. So it could be as simple as that, but you would like to move Nick Foles into a situation where he at least has a chance to succeed. But I don't think, to be honest, that should be on the top of the Eagles' list. The top of their list should be making this team in 2018 and beyond the best potential team it could be. And that means getting the most out of a Nick Foles trade. And by the way, if you don't get an acceptable trade, it might mean keeping the safety net in place. But
although John, he spoke glowingly today of Nate Sudfeld as well. Howie Roseman, at least, he said not only do they view him as a very capable backup, but they think he's a potential starter. I mean, what else? Yeah. A lot of it doesn't have to do with Wentz. It has to do with what you think about Sudfeld.
That's true, and they've had some conflicting comments over the weeks, and if you talked to Doug Peterson when Carson went down originally, he made a very, very big deal about having a backup quarterback with experience. Well, by nature, and then when it became Nick Foles and Nate Sudfeld, all of a sudden you don't have a backup with experience. And he said it was fine because they have a lot of confidence in Nate. So there was a bit of sort of contrasting opinions there. And there's not much you can do, obviously. You prefer to have a backup that's proven. It'd be great if you could keep Nick Foles for the long term and at little money. But the reality is you can't do that. So you have to cobble together your roster the best way possible. And if that means they have confidence in Nate Sudfeld, they truly believe he has starter potential in this league, I think the ultimate decision on Nick Foles becomes even easier if they really, really do believe that.
Yeah, and one of the things that Howie Roseman said is we're trying to keep as many good players as possible. Does that mean if you don't get re-signed, you weren't a good player in their eyes?
Not necessarily. I mean, there's certain guys we've talked about on the list. Bo Allen, I think, would be at the top of the list. Trey Burton. I don't think they're going to be able, at the end of the day, in their salary cap situation. Remember, before Donnie Jones, they got a little bit of space back with his retirement, but they were projected to be about $9.5 million over the cap for the start of the new league year. That means cuts, that means extensions, that means restructures, just to create some room. And think about all the free agents they have. I think the top of that list is Nigel Bradham. And then you have to talk about Patrick Robinson. We just mentioned Burton and Bo Allen. Even a guy like Corey Graham, who's very, very important to this defense. Like Garrett Blunt, do you want him back? Darren Sproles, do you want him back? All of these names are free agents, and you don't have the space to sign any of them as we speak today before you do some other maneuvering. So it would be, as Howie said, the salary cap isn't going to prevent us from signing good players, but the reality, he also admitted they're not obviously the Cleveland Browns or the New York Jets after they cut Mo Wilkerson today, have about $100 million to work with. The Eagles are just not in that type of situation.
John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com, covers the Eagles, covers the NFL. You can read his NFL columns and the Eagles coverage at 97.3 ESPN. If you have a Eagles or NFL question for John, send us a text, 609-403-0973. We'll try to ask him some of your questions here. Roseman isn't ready for a short sale. You wrote that today at 97.3 ESPN.com as he spoke to the Philly media for the first time. And, he basically is insinuating here that they're comfortable with their roster, but they do want to, try to make upgrades because they want to make another run at this thing. They don't want this just to be a one-year thing. So when you say he says short sale, what is he implying?
Well, he's implying they don't want to cut players because of salary cap implications. And, one thing we know about Howie is he's very good at maneuvering around the salary cap. And as I said, you'll see restructures, you'll see extensions. I do not think you will see large-scale cuts to get this team in position to re-sign certain free agents that we potentially mentioned. Remember, they also need space for their incoming draft class. Even though they don't have a second or third round pick as we speak today, you mentioned the possibility of moving down from 32nd overall to sort of regain capital. There's also the potential of trading certain players. Nick Foles, top of that list. Michael Kendricks, potentially. Vinny Curry. All of these, there's going to be a lot of maneuvering, but I don't think there's going to be a lot of high-profile free agents coming in. I think it's going to be very, very targeted. A lot of their work was already done in season by signing the extensions with Alshon Jeffrey specifically and Tim Jernigan. And then if you think about what they did last year with the one-year prove-it deals and hitting home runs with Jeffrey and Patrick Robinson specifically, I think you might see some of that. But the Eagles are just not in the position to go spend to bring in the Ndamukong Suhs of the world if he gets on the street. A lot of people have speculated about that. They just don't have the space to bring in players like that.
And he said that. He said there's a lot of cap room out there. There's teams with a ton of cap room, but we're not going to make decisions. We're not going to get rid of good players because of our cap situation. That responsibility starts with me. So he's here saying, look, I know I'm viewed as the guy who figures this all out, and it's my job to figure out ways to make it all work and get it all to fit. And, last year when we looked at this team, they don't have any cap space. They can't. He figured out ways to get it done.
Yeah, he always does, and that's why he was the executive of the year, and I think it was well-deserved. Now, we talked about it last year, at least at the starting block, where we are today. It's even worse this year as far as the cap implications go, but he's very good with it, and if he does want to keep a player or find a way to bring somebody in, he's generally going to find a way to do it. At some point, you do hit a breaking point, and I think he admitted that by pointing out how much cap space is out there with other teams. Just mentioned the Browns and Jets at the top of this league, literally have 9 figures to spend. So that's tough to deal with if you want to bring in a high impact player. But the good news is the Eagles are very deep, and they don't need a lot. They've already proven they have a Super Bowl roster, and I don't think that's going to change in this offseason. They're going to be a significant contender again.
Again, when pushed on specifics, Roseman would just again say our intention is to keep all of our good players. Those decisions include Bradham, Robinson, Burton, Blunt, Sproles, Allen, safety Corey Graham. We know they need a new punter at least now, so this isn't going to be an easy offseason. And we see, John, a lot of times, typically the Super Bowl champion doesn't seem to fall off. It's the team that makes it to the Super Bowl. They seem to kind of vanish away. But it's not ridiculous to say, hey, you make it to the Super Bowl one year, and then you're out on the outside looking in the very next year. So you can't just rest on your laurels.
No, and I think a lot of that has to do with that's where it comes into sort of Doug Peterson's job and his purview, and the fact that you got to find a way to motivate the players again, because there's the natural human nature of breathing a sigh of relief and saying, we did it, because this is such a grind, this league, and then all of a sudden you got to start up again in April with off-season work, and you just finished. And it becomes very, very difficult to start from square one and climb the same mountain again. But, it's Howie's job to put together this 90-man off-season roster and then hand it to Doug Peterson. And it's got to be Doug's job to make sure these players are motivated and have the same kind of hunger they had this year.
Yeah, John, and Roseman, Peterson, they both have a lot of work to do. They have, they were asked about the intentions with Nick Foles. I guess, we talk about free agents, but this has got to be equally at the top of their list. That whole situation.
Yeah, and obviously Carson Wentz's injury plays into it, makes it a little bit more difficult because of the timing. Will he be ready for week one?
And they were a little vague on Wentz today. Just saw we hope to get him back.
Yeah, and rightfully so. I mean, there's no reason to add pressure by saying he's going to be back week one. He's going to be back for the last preseason game. He's going to be ready. If you do that, all of a sudden you put unneeded pressure on the guy to rehab. But what Howie said is what I've said consistently, and I think everybody who's ever met Carson, he's going to do the work. That's not even a question. He's an overachiever as far as work ethic goes. And from that standpoint, they're not concerned at all. That's why I've said from day one, I believe he will be out there week one. But worst case scenario, even if he's not, and if he's scheduled to come back week 2, week 3, even week 4, I don't think that should prohibit this team from trading Nick Foles if they can get significant draft picks in return. Because then we saw Tom Brady last year being suspended for 4 games. Well, the Patriots did fine. They weathered the storm and then made their run. I think that's the way you have to approach it. It can't be about Carson's rehab. It's got to be about what's best for the Philadelphia Eagles. And if they're able to get significant draft picks, that's what's best for the Philadelphia Eagles.
John McMullen, NFL questions for John. Send them via text message, 609-403-0973. We'll get to a couple here in a second. John, let's look at some of the NFL stuff. The Gronkowski stuff, the expectations in Rappaport saying is that he will return in 2018. There was some talk that the WWE might make a run for him, and there was some talk after the Super Bowl that he might retire. Gronk has already appeared in WWE. I don't know that he would be a full-time competitor doing that right now, but is the thought that Gronkowski could retire?
Well, there is. I think that WWE part is overblown. He loves wrestling, and his best friend Mojo Rawley is a wrestler, but you can't make the same amount of money. I think the bigger thing is Dwayne Johnson, another wrestler, who happens to be the biggest box office star in the world, has kind of gotten in his ear and said he could be an action movie star. Now, if that's a potential, and there are roles for him in Hollywood, I think he would walk away yesterday with that kind of money on the table. But that's very, very difficult to do, and there's no evidence that Rob Gronkowski could even – obviously, you don't have to be Sir Laurence Olivier as an actor to be an action star, but you do have to have some semblance of being able to do it, and there's no evidence he does. So until that happens, I think he's going to play football, and I think it was a little bit overblown.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to see a guy just say, you know what, I'm going to go leave, and then I'm going to go perform in the WWE. That would be a huge, loss for obviously the Patriots, but an interesting, I guess, option for football players who, the concussions. Not that the WWE, you get concussions and stuff there too. That's not like it's like a heck of a lot, but safer than playing football.
Yeah, I think a lot of it depends on what kind of schedule. If you get a Brock Lesnar type schedule and you only have to show up 20, 25 times a year and you're getting paid $5-6 million a year, that's a good deal. But if it's full time and you got to be on the road 300 times a year, everybody who's done it both says that's more difficult on your body than playing football. So I don't think he would be interested in anything like that. And from WWE standpoint, I don't see that electric personality that's going to translate and automatically sell out arenas and headline pay-per-view. So I really don't think it's fit for either side.
Muhammad Wilkerson released today. He second-team All-Pro for 2 years. He signed a 5-year, $86 million deal back in July. He was inactive for many games, suspended. It turned out to be a mess. Will there be a market for Wilkerson?
Yeah, he still has a chance to be a good player. Obviously, if I were king of the world tomorrow, you just mentioned the number, 5 years, $86 million, and we saw Mike Glennon. The Bears confirmed they're going to be moving on from him, and his contract was spun. Understand, when you see these contracts being signed, that's all agent speak when you see those big numbers. And they generally all tend to be 1 year or 2 year contracts. In the case of Wilkerson, a 2 year deal where he made significant money, but then the Jets had an out with little salary cap penalty, and they took it. So I think we need to start telling the truth about these contracts and what they really are.
A couple other things. Matt Forte announced his retirement. Jonathan Stewart released, another guy, 10 years. He spent all his career with the Panthers, so you wonder if he'll find work here this offseason. And Martavius Bryant, he's interesting because they're saying no intentions of trading him. There was a whole big mess with him at the trade deadline anyway. They didn't use him all that much. You would think if the way they used him last year, that if they had a decent offer for him, they'd be willing to move him.
Yeah, and I think they still would be willing. I mean, the worst thing you can do if you want to move a player is say, we're going to trade him, because obviously that affects the value. So that's what you do. You say we have no intention, and you try to build up as much value as there can possibly be. Unfortunately, in Brian's case, he was such a bad teammate at times, complaining. That was the reason why the Steelers couldn't trade him in the first place. So I think they're trying to rebuild. There's no doubt he has some talent, but as we've seen in this league, sitting in the locker room means a lot, and they will seriously deduct points. We saw Marcus Peters get moved for it turned out to be a second and fourth round pick. The more interesting part to me was only 2 teams were in the running. They called all 31 teams and nobody wanted them. And from a talent standpoint, that's easily a top 10 cornerback in this league.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And then last on the list, I guess, the Mike Glennon experience is over in Chicago. A lot of experiments in Chicago seem to be over. Willie Young released 2. Purnell the other day. So Glennon, though, he got 18.5 for his time in Chicago. That's not a bad day. That's not a bad stop in the Windy City.
And if you think about the Chicago Bears and that decision, and you see what Nick Foles did for nothing, essentially, $5 million here, and you start to think to yourself, boy, it's a wonder how some of these GMs keep their job. And by the way, I'm not exactly thrilled with the way Mitchell Trubisky looked last year. So the Bears are going to have some struggles, especially in that division.
All right, John, at JF McMullen, there always seems to be so much football to discuss. Every time we think we have more topics we want to get into, we always run out of time here on our mandatory football every day right here on the Sports Bash on 97.3 ESPN. At JF McMullen on Twitter. We'll answer more of the listener questions, some good ones today here on the Bash. Thanks, pal.
All right, thank you, Mike.